Welcome to our workshop on what the evidence says about how to best take science to policymakers. We are really honored to be part of this conference with you all and want to sincerely thank the host committee for putting together such an excellent program. I'm Jessica Pugel. I'm a research associate with the Research Policy Collaboration, and I'm here with my colleagues, Dr. Toria Hurd and Dr. Chala Girai. Toria, do you want to take a moment to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, super excited to be here to talk about such an interesting topic. My name is Dr. Toria Hurd. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at Penn State and also a policy associate with the Research to Policy Collaboration.
And Chala?
Hi everyone, echoing Toria, I am excited to be in this workshop and sharing our work with you. I'm a previous director of communications at NPR for Research to Policy Collaboration, and now I am working with a social impact team of Weber Shandwick PR agency.
And we are so happy to have both of them with us for this presentation. We're all from Research Policy Collaboration, or at least we have connections there, and that's housed in Penn State. And we work to improve the relationships between researchers and policymakers. In the next hour and a half, which is a good amount of time, we're going to answer 3 main questions and pair each question with an activity so you can practice it. By the end of this workshop, you will have finished the first draft of your very own fact sheet. And if that sounds daunting, don't worry, we will walk you through it. In the chat, we're going to put 2 documents, both in document form and in link form, so you can download whichever version works best for you. One of them is a blank worksheet, and the other is a completed worksheet example. You'll need these as we go along, so please download and open them now. The first question we're going to answer is, how can I write my research as an engaging story? And Tori is going to discuss the importance of tailoring to your audience, following a story arc, and presenting data effectively. And afterwards, you'll provide some information about the problem you want to write a fact sheet about. Then Chala will answer the question, how do I present my possible solutions? And we'll show how much relationships matter, why an educational approach is most effective, and what an educational approach really looks like. After that, you will draft your own menu of policy options for the problems that you work on. Last, I will talk about how and what you can do to make sure that your resource, your fact sheet is received well, which includes establishing and maintaining credibility, aligning with policymaker norms, and stopping misinformation. After that, you'll be able to revise the language of your fact sheet to abide by those recommendations and format it in a template that we provide. I'm going to hand it off to Toria now to explain, I'm going to hand it off to Chala now, my bad, to explain what the Research to Policy Collaboration does.
Hey everyone, thank you, Jessica. So Research to Policy Collaboration is an innovative work. It's a theory-driven approach to facilitating trust and productive relationships between researchers and policymakers. Trust and productive relationships are bolded here because they are very important, and we will dive into why the value of both of this moving forward. Okay, we said this is a theory-driven approach, but how this works. So we first listen to congressional policy priorities and goals. And then we move to finding researchers, identifying and exploring researchers with related knowledge and experience. Then we match and pair them with the relevant legislative and policy needs for researchers. And then we move to, again, listening congressional policy priorities and goals, making sure that it's still relevant, still timely. And we respond by organizing this input from network and engaging researchers and making sure that the research, the evidence is synthesized and usable for the relevant legislation or policy need. And then we repeat. So we've found that this approach actually worked and was successful. Results from our randomized control trial show that 23% more legislative offices participated in the RPC model than the control group included research language, the terminology in their child and family bills. This was a big success for us, showing that actually building trust and relationships with our model, we can enhance the use of evidence in policymaking. So this supported the overall model, and RPC has studied science communication strategies through a series of 75 plus rapid cycle RCTs and still ongoing. And these are a couple of snapshots from our work. And on the left, you are seeing one of our first meeting with, these are our researchers across the nation that we've identified and invited to DC pre-pandemic. And it was a great day, great success for us, because we are still working with the congressional office, this congressional office, and supporting their efforts on child and family policy bills. And the second one is an example of a fact sheet, a synthesis of research that we shared with our congressional offices. And again, at the end is like a seminar training that we give to our researchers, because it's important to make sure that we are merging the two worlds and making sure the language is accurate across two worlds. And we have a researchers network. We would love if you join, and if you want to engage and contribute to evidence, increasing the evidence in policymaking. There's a link there, but we can also share it in the chat, and would love for you to be part of our network.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started then with our worksheet. So if you are able to go ahead and download those worksheets that I put in the chat, there is a blank one that you're going to fill out throughout the entirety of the workshop today. And then there is also an example one that we have already filled out, so you can kind of model after. Can you go ahead and just let me know if you have any trouble downloading those? Hopefully that worked. So what I'd like you guys to start with is defining the problem. So as researchers, we are interested in a research question or a research agenda that is related to a problem that we want to solve, right? And so in broad terms, I want you to take just a minute or two here and think about, what is the overarching problem that I am working on? What is the big picture issue? And I want you to think big and broad here, okay? So the big picture context. And so to give an example of what the research to policy collaboration is doing, is they are interested in understanding the gap between researchers and policymakers. Okay, so big and broad. So go ahead, just take a second, write that down. And then once you have that brainstormed, I want you to get a little bit more specific. So if you think about the issue that you're working on as the big puzzle, what piece are you contributing? What is the slice of the pie that you're working on? And you can think about this maybe from the research questions that you're working on, maybe the last couple of papers that you published, whatever it is. Think about the smaller piece of the puzzle. And so again, to give you an example, the research to policy collaboration is interested in why research doesn't have its intended social impact. There's this disconnect between researchers and policymakers. So a little bit more specific than the gap between research and policy, right? So it'll be super important for the rest of the workshop if you kind of have the issue that you want to address in mind as we get going with the content for today. So I'm going to give you just another minute to brainstorm. Okay, hopefully everyone has that down. And I'm going to share some content. So Jess, if you could, thank you. So today I'm going to talk about how to think about your research, how to think about defining this problem into an engaging story. And there are some key pieces of this. We need to understand our audience. We need to know the structure of a story, how to frame our story, and we need to know how and when to use data. All right. So let's get started. You can go ahead and move to the next one, Jess. Thank you. So to communicate effectively to an audience outside of your specific research field, your typical strategy is probably going to need adaptation. And too often we kind of jump into a strategy, into kind of our action steps without really defining what or who we're trying to influence. And that has to be our first step. So now that you guys have kind of thought about your problem, you want to get clear on two things. Who are you trying to reach and why? What is your goal? Answering both of those questions as you think about effective science communication is going to help you tailor an appropriate strategy most effectively. And so today I'm going to talk about how to tailor your strategy to specifically reach policymakers and with the goal of understanding a specific piece of your research. All right. And that's why I had you do that activity at the beginning to kind of keep your problem in mind as we move forward. And it's important to think about the audience because even in the policy world, even as we talk about policymakers today as our audience, they're very heterogeneous depending on the level of government, the political party, even within party lines, there's a lot of heterogeneity. So it's important to have some specifics about your audience from the get-go. So effective science communication is going to require recognizing those differences between how scientists or researchers have traditionally been taught to communicate their research and then how the rest of the world communicates. And as you probably know from your own research, that scientific papers and presentations generally follow a specific format, this specified kind of structure. And this is not true for the majority of other types of communication. So scientists often present pages of background information, trying to set the stage, give the theory, give the background, and help to understand what the gaps are, right? And then there's a specific focus on methods, how they got it done. And not to the end do we know what we found and what it means. Right? So in a scientific paper, you spend a lot of time establishing credibility before you get to the main point. The rest of the world, especially policymakers, lead with the conclusions. That's what people care about, right? So what are your findings? Why is it relevant to them? And what is your bottom line? Okay, that's what you want to lead with. And again, when you're identifying your bottom line, this is probably going to be tailored to the specific audience you're communicating with. So that's why, again, it's important to start with your who, because to tell a good story, you first need to know who you're communicating with, what they value, what makes them tick, and how can you engage with them in a way that's compelling and authentic. Authentic relationships are the best way to kind of get a story across or make it stick, right? And so it's important to understand that policymakers and researchers operate quite differently from each other. So a few key things to understand about policymakers. First, they have information overload. They receive tons of information every day from different stakeholders. They receive hundreds of emails, and it's impossible to assimilate this much information on a day-to-day basis. They also use different information sources from researchers. Researchers tend to stick to peer-reviewed journals, but policymakers not only often don't have access to academic journals, but may not be able to synthesize that information very well without a scientific background. So they often rely on political leaders, advocates, and news articles for information. And then because they have this overload of information, coupled with an inability to develop expertise on a subject matter, they'll often do what we call reading people, not reports. So since they need to know information across so many different topics, if you think about your policymakers, they need to know things related to homeland security, human trafficking, economic development, right? Like they are stretched across a variety of topics. And so they kind of have this broad but shallow understanding of these things. And term limits reduce the ability to generate an expertise. Plus, policy priorities are constantly shifting. So it's hard to kind of drill down into any one subject matter. And so they rely on information from their constituents, from their stakeholders, from their interest groups, from other political leaders. And as a result of having to make decisions quickly based on that large amount of information, they're taking shortcuts to gather that information quickly and kind of assimilate it in a way that will help them make a decision. So they develop these heuristics, and that can include prioritizing certain kinds of information over others. They also tend to draw on gut feelings or emotions. And they have a higher tolerance for ambiguity than most researchers probably do. So they're okay with not understanding a topic in its fullness and still being able to make a decision around it. So that said, research is just one consideration that policymakers have when they're making decisions. Decisions can be based on a lot of things, including their values, their emotions, their outside interests. Most policymakers are interested in being responsive to their voters and their interest groups, including matching on ideological values. And so researchers really need to have a seat at the table for their voices to be heard too, for evidence-based science to be included in decisions and in policy. But the problem is that scientists often don't know the best means of communicating, right? We cannot come at policymakers with a fire hose of information. We can't come at them with a peer-reviewed journal article that has 6 to 8 pages of background information before we get to the point, right? Cognitive research tells us that the human brain can only absorb about 3 to 5 pieces of information at a time. And so it's important when you're communicating with a policymaker to really prioritize what you share based on what they need to know and how you can best connect with them. And that's going to be over common interests and shared values. Okay, another important piece to know about the difference between researchers and policymakers is how we're defining evidence. So researchers are often insular. They emphasize the scientific methods and they prioritize methodological rigor in their communication of science, right? They also are quick to understand the limitations of their study and present a lot of caveats around their conclusions. As I mentioned previously, policymakers need information quickly, and so they usually have a much higher tolerance for ambiguity. And so they're not as worried about the methodological rigor or the limitations, right? They're okay with drawing quick conclusions. And the easiest way for them to do this is to rely on anecdotes or stories, or even quick assessments like polls. Plus, they love local data because that can speak directly to their constituents, right? So when we as researchers present information to policymakers, it needs to be relevant and really engage their values and their emotions in order for it to get across in a more compelling way. So since this is the case, researchers need to go beyond presenting facts and evidence and work on creating emotional connections through their communication efforts. This can be really challenging, especially if you have different values from the policymaker that you're communicating with. And so the best way to kind of navigate this is to first know your own values, know your own personal boundaries, and then consider where is there underlying common ground between us. A good place to start is core American values that are hopefully common ground between you. Equality, hard work, freedom, fairness. These are things that Americans value that can be compelling frames to use when you're engaging with a policymaker. And even if you don't agree with everything that they say, there's often ways that you can find an underlying value that does align, that you can reinforce in your conversation rather than challenging that thing that you don't agree with. Challenging can ostracize them, can make them feel unheard. And so we want to avoid that. The thing is that many scientists, many researchers believe that if they simply share what they know, non-scientists will be convinced and will change their views. And this just isn't true. Research in the field of science communication demonstrates that simply sharing more scientific information doesn't change minds, attitudes, or behaviors. Instead, because people are usually interpreting information through the lens of their own values, they will reject information that feels threatening to those values or feels like a dissonance between what they think or believe. And so even though we feel like as researchers, as scientists, right, like data speaks, like, let me just put out the statistics, let me put out the numbers, like this is compelling. The data says this, that is not actually an effective means of convincing someone to change their views. So RPC, the Research to Policy Collaboration, which you already heard a little bit about from Chala, and she's going to talk more about our model, really gets at this through a nonpartisan relationship development technique. And so we work on this by approaching policymakers without an agenda and keeping information nonpartisan. So this is a really good way to avoid a value conflict right off the bat. If your personal ideological values do not align with the policymaker that you're speaking with, it's important to keep your information or your research as nonpartisan as possible. We also try to do some perspective taking and understand where they are coming from so that we can best support their goals with evidence-based science. But we have to be careful because even our own research questions, the questions that we ask or how we're interpreting our results can be shaped by our own values or our own worldview. So it's just important to kind of be aware of those potential conflicts and try to capitalize on as much common ground as you can. All right, so now that we know who we're trying to reach and what our goal is in reaching them, it's time to discuss our strategy. So one strategy that is important is storytelling. Narratives or stories are easier to comprehend or remember. I bet if you think about the last time that you heard some compelling information, something on the news, read an article, heard something from a friend, you did not pick out and remember the statistics, the numbers, right? You probably remembered the anecdotes, the way it made someone feel, the evocative language, the story, right? So stories are easier to comprehend, they're easier to remember, they're more engaging than traditional logical scientific communication. And it also helps the audience to simplify information. So when you come at it from this huge, like high level scientific information, the importance of the issue can get lost. But talking about it in a story format helps to simplify the information and make it more digestible. And this is helpful not only to the policymaker, but also as they relay information to their constituents. So if you do this well, the problem is usually much more illustrative and it helps make the next step, policy actions, more viable. So again, anecdotes, intuitive arguments, those things are probably going to carry more weight than statistics. They can be especially persuasive to policymakers' constituents. Again, these people are not sophisticated consumers of statistical evidence. So the data does not speak to them the way that it does to a research or scientific audience. Stories are also evocative. They engender empathy. Stories are the best tool we have as humans for understanding what it feels like to be someone else and for creating empathy about someone else's situation. Stories also help give context to a problem, and so that can lend itself well to a focus on solutions. If you're able to not merely state the problem, but also give options and highlight the benefits of solving the problem, this will give hope. This will create a feel-good factor that people are more positive about. Okay, so I want to give you some examples from our messaging trials. So in our research with the Research to Policy collaboration, we've seen that narratives inspire action. So in sending an email to policymakers with fact sheets, the fact sheets were clicked on more if they used language that was that told a story, right? So you can see the picture on the left begins with, my team and I wrote a fact sheet on this topic, whereas the email on the right says, my empowerment journey, it's hard to see, as a Native American and Latinx mother of 7, that kind of giving context, giving story, like that was more likely to be opened and read. We've also seen that emails that emphasize the solution over the problem are opened more. And so you can again see the top email says, studies have shown this. It's an annual crime burden of $2 trillion. This kind of crisis messaging or problem messaging is not as opened as using a more relational perspective. I hope you're doing well. I wanted to share this. There are some solutions that we can talk about around this specific issue. And then using emotion within our communication, right? Emotional words affect our subsequent actions. And so you can see here that subject lines, email subject lines, the stars are the ones that performed best. So using language like social disparities in policy rather than information on or research on, right? Difficulties with COVID testing rather than strategies for COVID testing. And then new solutions versus threats. Again, there's some subtle cue of emotion here that could be why that outperformed. All right, so how to tell a good story. These are things that you probably recall from your middle school, high school days of what are the pieces of a story. And narratives kind of follow this particular structure, and it allows for a cause-effect relationship. So I want you to think about, in telling a story, what is the setting that you can create? How can you describe the situation and use specific examples or anecdotes to create context or to ground your points? Characters, who are the people that your research affects. Conflict, again, what's the problem? And then resolution, what are the options for solving it? So I'm going to give you a quick example. So right now I'm working on a project around child sexual abuse survivors and post-traumatic stress disorder. And so if you think about somebody, a child who was sexually abused repeatedly over the course of their childhood, they experience often some sort of post-traumatic stress symptoms. So anytime that there's a situation that reminds them of the abuse, maybe it's the smell of alcohol that their abuser used to drink before abusing them, maybe it's the sound of a door opening, that elicits an emotional trigger, a PTSD trigger, right? And yet, most often, survivors of child sexual abuse do not develop a PTSD diagnosis. There's evidence for these survivors also developing what we call resilience or positive development in the face of this chronic adversity. And so when we talk about research around resilience and how do we create resilience in trauma survivors, it's important to think about options here. So we can create more trauma-informed care in schools. We can do screening in practice that can be better incentivized. We can think about upstream prevention, including investing in policies that might increase access to services. So you can see that I created a setting around an abusive situation. I talked about a participant or a character. I discussed the conflict and then also outlined several options for resolution. And I want to give a quick note about data presentation. So data should be used to support your story. I'm not saying that you can't ever use data. We are researchers, data speaks, we understand that, right? But we don't want to use it out of context in a way that's unhelpful. We want to use data to support our storytelling. And so it can be persuasive and powerful when it's in a useful form. So think about making your data examples quick and skimmable. Graphs or charts can be especially helpful for visually summarizing your message. And then we want to think about local data, like people in X state. This again speaks to the policymakers' constituents. Data on the priority of the issue, like prevalence rates, can be really helpful for setting context. Public support, like parent or teacher opinions of something. And then cost, because policymakers want to know that tax dollars are being used efficiently, right? So it's okay to use numbers and statistics as long as you're using them to provide context and they are helping ground your points and be illustrative. Okay, so that said, I want us to spend the next couple of minutes thinking about 1 to 2 specific examples from your research that can be helpful in grounding your points or providing context. And so again, this could be an anecdote, this could be a meaningful statistic, this could be a graph that summarizes something really well. But I want you to, on your blank document, think about 1 to 2 specific examples or data points that are going to illustrate the problem or the issue that you identified at the beginning of the session. So I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to do that. You can see on the slide here that we have some examples. So the majority of, again, thinking back to our issue on why doesn't research have its intended social impact? Well, one data point is that the majority of state legislators are enthusiastic about using research, but 30% of legislators don't use it, okay, despite that enthusiasm. So there's a disconnect happening here, right? Academics are encouraged to limit their engagement to other academics, not to the public, right? This is like another specific example that can really help support why there's a disconnect. So I want you to think about, again, in your research, based on your issue that you identified, what are some examples or data points that help ground that? I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to do that. And if you're struggling or if you have questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask or put something in the chat. We want this to be a useful activity for you. So let us know if something is not clear. For those who have joined in the last couple of minutes, thank you, welcome. We are doing an activity. If you can go ahead and download the worksheets in the chat. You can try to catch up based on the directions on the worksheet, but otherwise keep joining us and just listening throughout the rest of the session. We're going to move on to the next presentation here in just a second.
I think we can wrap it up and switch to the second part of our presentation. But please feel free to continue working on the worksheet, and our goal is for you to have a built up and at least a template at the end of our session. Now in this second section, we will talk about how to develop your solutions. How do I present my possible solutions? And it is important, as Toria mentioned, our audience and making sure that we are tailoring our communication for our audience. So I'm going to talk about how to do that in this part. And our second strategy, we label this as being an honest broker. How can we reach across the aisle? How can we be this nonpartisan brokers that can provide objective evidence, objective research evidence to the policymakers? Toria mentioned, and I presented in the beginning, we know that by evidence, public policy can benefit from scientific evidence and amplify the intended social impact. But there are some barriers and some facilitators that we can provide. Absence of personal contact, lack of timely and relevant research. Unfortunately, these are two important barriers that we see. Your research could be valuable, but if it's not timely and if it doesn't align with what's happening in the world at the moment, then we might lose the momentum. Or mutual mistrust, building a trusted relationship between congressional staffers and researchers, bridging two worlds, it is important. And also lack of access to research and poor dissemination. We publish our research mostly in peer-reviewed publications and outlets, but congressional staffers or other readers may not be aware, may not have access to that research. So we need to make sure we are tailoring our dissemination for a broader audience. That said, there are some facilitators that we can increase the use of research in policy. Personal contact and relationships are very important, which aligns with the trust and collaboration. Again, timely relevance is important. Summaries with policy recommendations and research synthesis. As Toria mentioned, we cannot share 40-page articles with congressional staffers because they don't have time, and there is no validity of digesting that information in a short amount of time and making it relevant. So it's important for us to make sure that we are providing summaries and evidence-based recommendations and synthesizing that information. So and evidence has shown that these facilitators, especially building relationships based on mutual trust and collaboration, are important. So when we think about how can we build this working relationship with congressional staffers, how can we make sure that we are a trusted entity that can collaborate with them and amplify the use of research in policymaking and decision making? What is the secret sauce? And that is the second strategy that we're presenting today: honest brokering. We saw ourselves as honest brokers, meaning who present science and nonpartisan policy recommendations to congressional audiences across the aisle. It is important for us to report information between two parties without attempting to match these preconceived views and values. So our primary goal is to provide factual information to support evidence-based, informed decision-making, but not to encourage or endorse certain policy solutions, which is also called lobbying, and I'm going to touch on that in a second. Like I said, our secret sauce is trust and relationship building. Because trust guides inquiry, acquisition, and the use of information, you might have such a strong evidence and powerful information or a action-oriented solution, but if you do not build trust with the person that you're communicating with, then you may not be able to convey your message in the way you wanted to. So non-biased objectivity is key of being an honest broker. We need to be policy neutral and focus on evidence and present many off-policy options that based on evidence, not solutions. Of course, citing resources and refraining from self-disclosure about political orientation is important. You as your personal identity, you might have a specific orientation, political orientation, but as a researcher, as an honest broker, it is important for us to think that, okay, I am presenting the evidence and the facts that will lead the policy recommendation or solution for them. Again, transparency is really important. When I talk to congressional staffers, one of the things that I saw how I built trust was like, okay, accepting the fact that I may not know everything related to legislation, acknowledging my limitations in knowledge and say, okay, thank you for sharing that. I actually don't know the details and I would really appreciate if you can share that with me, giving them the autonomy of they can teach me something and vice versa. When researchers accepted that I don't have enough knowledge about this, but I can check and come back to you, I saw that we built lots of relationships, and it was an eye-opening experience for especially staffers that researchers are not trying to preach me from their ivory tower. They're actually here to help me. And that also related to respecting staffers. It is important, they are not elected officials, but they are the gatekeepers. They are the opinion shapers. They are the ones who will bring the information at the table of the elected officials and say, okay, this is important and I have evidence that we can solve, and I connected to X, Y, Z person in that network. So all of this comes together and brings us the secret sauce of honest brokering, and actually really important details for us to increase use of research in policy. So as we all know, we are now living in a virtual world. Virtual connections and relationships to drive business decisions. So it was important for us with RPC Research to Policy Coalition to find an effective way to maintain and enhance those congressional relationships. Because we were not able to knock their door and give our business card and make that connection in person. So we realize the importance of personal touch and how can we bring that personal touch into virtual world and continue building our relationships. Policymakers, like I mentioned, personal contact and relationships are important. They want to hear from real people, and they are sensitive to persuasion from advocacy entities. So we started to send emails coming from one person, like, hello, Michael, I am this and this and this, and this is my research, and I would be happy to help you, like you were seeing on the left. As compared to a newsletter coming from an organization called Research to Policy Collaboration. We are not lobbying, we are nonpartisan, but congressional staffers at first sight, they are not aware of that. So we actually tested this and found that if we send email as an individual rather than an organization, emails with a human sender name are accessed 7 times more than emails with an organization sender's name. And I remember we received so many replies when we send out emails like this from researchers and build connections that led us to produce fact sheets, like Toria show an example, that led us to be invited in the congressional testimonies, be invited in roundtables, for us to become a trusted entity as compared to a newsletter. So this was another evidence of showing how human touch and personalization is important when you are building congressional relationships. Another important thing, and it is, as I mentioned in the beginning, why we are honest brokers, it's avoiding the slippery slope of lobbying. What is lobbying is encouraging and endorsing a certain policy solution. We are here to present facts and evidence. So any recommendations that we are making, it shouldn't be related to a legislation, rather it should be related to an issue, solving a problem in that state, or a legislative policy problem. So, but I know this sounds very vague, so we decided to put some examples of how can we avoid lobbying and what may sound like lobbying. For example, if you ask legislator to fund Medicaid, it's direct lobbying. It's like preparing for meetings and scheduling. It's an example of lobbying. Asking a group to contact their legislator to fund Medicaid, it's called grassroots lobbying. Again, it's preparing a call to action or coordinating action among others. Or preparing persuasive materials, encouraging Medicaid funding. Again, an example of lobbying. But you can contact your legislator to provide information about healthcare issues without mentioning Medicaid, without mentioning funding. That is not lobbying. You are actually sharing your evidence of facts that could lead a solution. Updating a group on the status of legislation without a call to action. Yes. Preparing a nonpartisan analysis regarding healthcare. You can use your data or research out there and bring a synthesis of information to the congressional staffer. It's a nonpartisan analysis, in other words. That is not lobbying. Or providing technical assistance on how to best implement a change to Medicaid per request. For example, we meet with congressional staffers, and when we go to them and ask, how can we support you? What evidence, what research we can share with you to help you? And that's technical assistance. Or you can draft a model legislation for education purposes, or how to use evidence in law. And these are not lobbying examples. So it all comes down to, for lobbying examples, whether you have a specific ask or not. And when we meet with staffers, for example, a little anecdote, when we ask, I'm not here with a specific ask, but I am here to support you. They are surprised because it is rare for them to meet someone who is there to be an honest broker, be an honest, objective, support technical assistance. As a summary of the things I mentioned, we focus on issues and evidence. So describing legislation objectively as it aligns or doesn't align with the evidence, rather than aligns or doesn't align with the ask, with other advocacy entities' mission. Making a list of policy options is always great because you can reach across the aisle, like I said in the beginning, but it will derive through your evidence. It's a nonpartisan communication with congressional staffers. It's an example of nonpartisan communication. Yeah, and describing legislation objectively, and describing how evidence might align or doesn't align with the specific legislation or the policy issue at the moment. And so for this part of our activity, we will look at 4th and 5th on your worksheet, and how can we make recommendations, and why should your audience care? It is important to think of this question, always keep this question in your mind as you write something, as you provide a recommendation. Think about your audience and what aspects of your work might resonate with your audience, the practical applications, the terminology that you're using. So it's really important to be mindful of what your audience cares about, what are their priorities and expectations from this relationship, and how can you connect them with what they value. This doesn't mean that you are going to change your personal alignment, your political alignment. This doesn't mean that you are going to change the results of your, or use a different language when you are presenting your results. This means that you are picking and choosing ways to frame your results or the information that you have so that you can catch the attention of your audience and make it relevant to them and make it relevant for their hopes for the future and moving forward. And so we have an example again here. We thought it might be helpful for you to see. For example, okay, we're talking to congressional staffers, and how can we make sure that the information I'm going to provide is going to be helpful for you? For example, you can say government is one of the biggest funders of research, yet research often fails to make it back to the hands of people who fund it and can use it to make decisions that affect the public, despite the desire of many researchers to have a social impact. So bringing that funding aspect, funding alignment, and actually the accessibility approach could catch the attention of the staffer or your audience when you're providing this. So like we did before, it is important when you are thinking about this, and you can again jot down some ideas you might have as we're completing the worksheet, but think that this is a call to action, but not a call to action for a specific issue, but call to action, communicating what is so what effectively, but based on facts and evidence. Because policymakers will be interested in different facets of your work, and you want your message to reflect their interests and accommodate their needs, so that you can translate the research into action and into decision-making process. So trying to understand their lens, the lens through which they are taking information, is really helpful as you go and frame your messaging. You can discuss opportunities to take specific action to address the problem, and focus on the positive results of taking action is really important when you're communicating with them, and being specific. So what are the beneficiaries? Who are going to benefit this? Where and when? You may not have all the answers, and it is okay to acknowledge your limitations, but coming up with a more concrete solution and evidence-based concrete solutions for them, it's really helpful as we build trust and enhance our communication with them. We can, I think, click one more. So following the prompt forward, as I mentioned, as we are thinking our audience, as I said, it's providing all the potential options for solving the identified problem is a good way to do it, because some staffers, some offices might be interested in one or the other. This doesn't mean that they're not going to align with one another. They're not going to contradict, but it is good to be able to reflect their lens, their messaging, their ideas, their values in your recommendations. So in this part of the activity, please list as many options as you can think of. It could be small or large scale, practical or impractical. We are just brainstorming. So you can just use your creative freedom here to talk about, circle the solutions policymakers are able to actually influence and act upon. And again, important to think of your evidence and important to think of the practicality, but be creative in this part of the activity. And please jot down if you have any questions, but I'm going to give you guys about 2 to 3 minutes just to think about some ideas, some potential options. And here we are seeing 3 different examples that could be helpful, that could be a good guide. For the sake amount of time, I'm not going to read all of them, but we can just keep this slide as a reference as you guys are thinking for like 2 to 3 minutes. All right. I hope this has been helpful for you to just think about some potential ideas. And I know this is a loaded, question-loaded task, but I hope everything would be really helpful. Everything I explained will be helpful in guiding your creative freedom. All right. And with that, I am handing off to Jessica.
Thanks, Chala. So we are on to our last strategy, which is about credibility in language and how you can use this last strategy in your fact sheet now that you have like the content of the fact sheet created. So the final question we're going to answer is what you can do in your fact sheet to make sure it's received well to start a longer conversation, right? The fact sheet isn't the end all be all of this communication. It's just the start of it. So let's start by talking about how to establish credibility. Unfortunately, gaining credibility isn't as easy as having a degree after your name. In fact, we've seen in some science communication tests that senders with doctor in the title aren't actually received any better or worse than those with no title. It's important that we figure out how to establish credibility, though, because when you are seen as more credible, they trust you more and you get to have a higher impact. You get to actually have those future conversations. Other science communication tests have shown that emphasizing your own credibility, your position, your background, it garners more attention than one that emphasizes purely the facts or the numbers. So you don't need to skimp on talking about why you should be trusted to provide that information. So we know that it is important to be credible, but how? The main way is to make it clear that your role is to inform and not persuade, and then do that. Just like Chala was mentioning, or talked for a good 10 minutes about honest brokerage, that's all that this is to inform. Policymakers are often approached by people with very specific asks, a policy end goal, and they're used to people trying to persuade them to do X or Y, and people who have an end goal like that in mind aren't seen as objective and credible. So you can boost your credibility by being clear that you're there to inform and not to persuade. Another way to establish your credibility is to show that you know how to interact with policymakers, and that means being attentive to policymaker norms. Abiding by norms has been shown to boost your credibility because it shows you know what you're doing. We know from the vast social psychology literature that we reward people for staying in line with norms across several social contexts. So this should really come as no surprise. The other reason we should try to abide by their norms is because it will boost your impact. They know how to deal with the information that they're used to, and therefore it's more likely that they can actually use that information. But what are those norms? There are three key ones, and these have come up throughout the other presentations, and so we're just repeating them again. But the first one is timeliness. Don't present irrelevant or outdated information, and gear it towards their concerns. Connect the dots for them for why it's relevant and timely. When you engage with policymakers, time it to be when it's actually useful for them. If they just passed a gun reform bill, it's probably not the time to give them more information on it. Instead, you should be anticipating what they may need based on the big problems of the day. For the past year, 18 months, that's been really easy. COVID and race relations are always relevant. Right now, specifically, infrastructure and social services are also really big because of the Build Back Better agenda. Climate policy was hot last week, but it's less so this week, right? Like this changes kind of at all the time, just very quickly. The next norm is to be local. What's true for California might not be true for Pennsylvania. So remember that policymakers represent their constituents first and foremost. If you have data for that specific jurisdiction, you should use it. And if you don't, then you should acknowledge that. In messaging trials, we've seen over and over and over again that one of the best ways to improve the reach of an email is to include the representative's name or district in the subject line, like how substance use affects Californians or fact sheet for Senator Smith. These things cue that you're giving them something locally relevant, and so they're more likely to pay attention to it. The final norm that we should be attentive to is being skimmable, or like having short enough stuff that you can scan it quickly. Policymakers have a lot of meetings. While your issue is certainly important, they meet with dozens of people a week about equally important issues, and they get thousands of emails in that same time frame. So make whatever you're going to communicate really quick to process. This means making skimmable fact sheets or policy briefs, ideally about 1 to 2 pages. You could also do talking points or videos. And we see this in our messaging tests as well. We have seen over and over again that shorter is better. The email that was shorter, which we see on the left, got 50% more clicks than the one that was longer, even though the longer one provided more information. There's one caveat to these findings, and that's that narratives, even though they're longer, tend to be engaged with more than the short typical emails. But narratives shouldn't make up the entire fact sheet, since that goes against the point of a fact sheet. So take away from this that shorter is better, but narratives are also still very powerful. Translating that into broader practice, it means that we need to be cognizant of the length of what we produce. Here are a couple examples of fact sheets that we produce, which will also give you a sense of how long yours should be. Here we see a clear date at the top, January 2021, that lets the policymaker know that how recent this evidence is. We distributed this one in January, and so it was helpful for them to know that this is like very recent evidence. We see here that it's really just 3 sections. It's what the problem is, why it exists, and some policy options. And notice that both of the main sections have subpoints, so it makes it skimmable. Also notice that why the problem exists is written to follow a story arc, kind of like Toria was discussing. And part of the honest brokerage, as Chala mentioned, is providing a range of policy options, and we see that here as well. And here we see it again. There's the date at the top, 2 or 3 main sections that are clearly separate and skimmable. Notice that there aren't a lot of numbers here. I see 21.3 million, but that's about it. It's okay to not present a lot of numbers. Policymakers are not reviewer number 2, right? But you should be ready with sources that do have more numbers if needed. Both of these fact sheets are just that. They're sheets about facts. But we know that stories and testimonials can be very effective too, like Tori mentioned. I also want to point out one last thing about these. They use really simple language. It says youth living in poverty, not impoverished youth. It says this divide may widen, not this disparity may be exacerbated by, right? So let's talk a little bit more about simple language. Using simple language and avoiding jargon also boosts your credibility and impact because it shows that you're credible enough to know your audience, which builds trust. There are a lot of ways we can simplify the language in a fact sheet. So what does using simple language even mean? It means pick one key point, provide supporting information, and repeat that. If you haven't noticed, we have had 2 main points of build trust and build relationships and tell your story, right? And we've repeated that several times now. Another way that you can use simple language is to be really straightforward with like the actual words that you choose. So that means avoiding jargon. We've seen in some messaging tests that it doesn't hurt receptiveness of the email or the resource, but it might reduce people's understanding if you do use jargon. Another thing you can do is reduce the amount of commas and semicolons in your sentences. If you have sentences or paragraphs with a lot of commas or semicolons, think about restructuring that sentence or paragraph to be more simple. You should be aiming for like a middle school reading level. And if you aren't sure, practice with family or neighbors or friends or I don't know, your dog, right? Someone who like doesn't know all of this and can be like, oh, like, I don't know what you mean by that word, or like, that was really confusing for me. One last straightforward language thing is to use people first language, like people with substance use disorders rather than substance users, right? It's more simple and it's also more ethical. The last way to use simple language is to actually simplify what we know. So focus on the body of evidence. Don't present every single study or even a few key studies. Instead, pull from the entire body of evidence. And when you pull from a body of evidence, that means that you don't have to present the limitations of every single study, since other studies usually make up for it. What you can do is talk about selective caveats. Don't be exhaustive with it. right? Like if the problem that you work on has only been studied in one region, you might mention how that might affect your recommendations and that that's a limitation of the evidence. You really have to strike a balance between being thorough and being convincing. And that's a really hard balance to strike, and it just takes practice. But overall, we should strive to be concise. The last thing I want to talk about is combating misinformation. So one way that we can do that is pre-bunking, is what it's called. It inoculates against misinformation. That's when you present why the counter arguments are flawed up front. You like say that here's what my evidence shows and here's what some counter evidence shows, but that counter evidence is misleading and here's why. It can backfire if you just say the argument or the counter argument, because that's actually enough to persuade people that it could be right. Instead, you can protect against that by explaining why the counter argument is wrong rather than just saying that it's wrong. The next thing you can do is to disclose uncertainty. Being honest about the uncertainty in the evidence base doesn't actually undermine the trust in science, but instead boosts the trust in what you're saying. So if you aren't sure about something, like you should say that, but you can't say that you aren't sure about everything, as researchers like to do. You have to acknowledge that you do know more about the topic than the policymaker likely does. So make the best recommendation that you can with the available evidence. The last thing you can do is indicate the evidence quality. Like I said on the last slide, you don't need to outline the strengths and limitations of every single study, but you can say it generally. You can say large sample size. You can say it has strong methods. You can say it's been replicated, stuff like that. Even something as short as high quality or low quality is better than nothing. We don't need to be exhaustive about the flaws of each study, but we do need to be honest about the state of evidence as a whole. So to recap, we learned that to improve the reception of your resource, you should abide by policymaker norms of timeliness, localness, and skimmability. You should also show that you know your audience by using simple language and simplifying what we know. And you can stop misinformation before it starts by being attentive to what counterarguments exist and being upfront about the quality of the evidence you're providing. All of this will boost your credibility and, in turn, your trust and their engagement with what you have to say. So it's time for the last activity, which is to create a fact sheet with information that you provided in the previous prompts. So this is what it looks like. We see prompt 1, prompt 2, prompt 3, prompt 4, and prompt 5, and you're just going to copy and paste right in there and then edit it to simplify the language, things like that. So this is prompt 1 and prompt 2, prompt 3, prompt 4, and prompt 5. And when we copy and paste that into a document, it looks like this. This is the first draft, and some of it needs to be simplified. Like prompt 4 maybe has a few too many commas. We might want to simplify that a little bit. We might want to choose very specific options instead of presenting all of these, something like that. So I'm going to give you some time to do this. This is the last presentation in our session, and so when you're done with that, like you can ask questions, you can put that in the chat. We also have a quick 3-question survey just to let us know how we're doing, if there's things that we could improve upon. And that link is at the top of one of the worksheets and also in the chat now. I see a question about, will the slides be shared with workshop participants? I can send them to the host committee. I don't know more specifics than that. Looks like we have just a few more minutes left, and so we want to make sure that we can address any questions that came up. Have a short discussion if anyone would like to. I did receive a question of, can you explain to us some of the benefits of joining the network? Who should join? Things like that. when you join our network, we can reach out about any questions that we receive from congressional offices. And I think Toria or Chala can talk more to this as well. But you get to hone your science communication skills. You can build a network with other policy interested researchers. You get to like have the social impact on policy. Chala and Toria, do you have anything to add to that?
No, actually, just you explained it well. And here the website, my voice is echoing, but I just shared a link on the chat where you can find more information and actually join to our website. If you click join now, you'll be able to pick your topic of areas and expertise and join our network. And if you have more information, please feel free to email us. Any other questions or things that our audience would like to touch on? I know we covered a lot, but I hope the worksheet will be helpful in guiding your future communication in your policy implications and with decision makers. And yes, if you can fill out our quick survey so we can make sure this presentation and workshop is better moving forward for future participants, we would really appreciate it. It's a quick survey.
Okay, well, it seems like there aren't any additional questions. The slides and everything are in the chat, so you can download those and use them in the future. We've really appreciated your attention today, and thanks again to AAAS for hosting this.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend.